Our presentation is going to be fairly raw, and hopefully it will be very self-critical. It'll be very politically personal. I don't mean about us as people, but us as organizers and doctors in a very challenging situation. You know that universal single-payer healthcare, were it to pass, would be the single most important policy issue that could possibly happen in our lifetimes to transform the democracy. It is opposed by a cadre of people in the country, the dark money in the country, that are very self-conscious, that understand that anything that empowers and organizes people and promotes democracy essentially cuts into their power and control and profits over the culture. PNHP has been for 20, 30 years an absolutely consistent and principled advocate for an uncompromising universal single-payer system. And it has essentially been more of an intellectual operation in large part, although there have been a lot of street operation going on over the years. But basically, doctors really represent a much more conservative, I mean that with a little c, conservative social community that tends to always be kind of in battle because we're constantly dealing with these terrible challenges of life and death all the time. And we know what we don't know. And so there's a certain facade and a certain privileged role that we play in society that essentially, in large part, governs and determines how we are, who we are, what we say, what we stand for, what we do, who we make friends with, and how we expose ourselves. When I got involved back again, for the last 20 years, I've been organizing teenagers in media arts here and haven't been at all involved in the health struggle because there hasn't really been a health struggle in California. But at the beginning of this year, legislation was introduced to establish a universal single-payer system now for the fifth time in California. We have a 2/3 Democratic majority in the Senate and in the Assembly, and we have a Democratic governor. So that you would imagine it would be a shoo-in because the single-payer bill has passed twice in California in the last 6 years and has been essentially vetoed by a Republican governor, by Schwarzenegger, twice, and then the third time it did not pass because Democrats didn't vote adequately for it. So when I decided to get back involved because of the tangibility of having a piece of legislation, we decided that we would put together a chapter, a PNHP chapter here in Sacramento. And I didn't really have a sense of the recent history in California, but what we walked into as we began to try and make something happen was we began to learn about what the status quo was for the organization. My 90% focus is on building PNHP in California and in the capital area, in the capital chapter area. The organization is a loose organization of people belonging who we're not really sure of who in fact is belonging, exactly what they really think, exactly what they're really willing to do, or to what degree they're willing to take on the historical moment that will expose them to criticism, unquestionably. And that's part of the cultural challenge that we have in dealing with our peers. So what happened was that we put together a chapter by getting the roster from national. We had 186 names on that roster, and we sent out a letter to all those 186 names by email in order to find out what we had out there, saying we're ready to go and we'd like to communicate with you. And roughly half of the emails bounced. So we began to make a commitment to personally phone call every single buddy on that roster in order to verify that they were actually there, that we weren't running a ghost ship, and to try and open up a personal conversation so that the people out there who had not been asked to do anything for well over 1.5 or 2 years would have some idea that they belonged to something real and that they were genuinely needed. And we are now down to about 46 names that we are pretty much sure are real people out of 186. And we then began to put together an ask. What could we ask our peers, knowing who they are, to get involved? One of the things we wanted people to do was to open their goddamn email. That's the first thing, because if they don't open the email, or if they don't pick up the phone and return the call, then we haven't hit square one. The second thing we wanted to have them seriously do is every month, if they were serious, bring in one new member every month. The third thing we wanted them to do was to write a letter, ideally once a week, to their local senator, their local assemblyman, and 2 or 3 newspapers that we would set up for them to rotate. And the letters would be 150 words, and they could be one of 5 or 6 issues. One thing we wanted them to talk about was what the benefit of single payer would be to their practice, what the benefit would be to their patients, what stories they could tell from the heart of their practice of the vignettes of suffering and issues that were going on that they were struggling with, what the benefit to their specialty might be in the event of a transformed system, and what their ethical and moral reasons were for becoming doctors in the first place. Those 5 content areas, which struck us as fundamental in terms of awareness, we wanted them to begin to share and communicate. We have not gotten a single letter, and we've only gotten 2 new members in 6 months. And we have been calling now 4 or 5 times, every single buddy on the list, and we've had 2 major general meetings that have had more than 40 people at them with major speakers, but we're still struggling with the quietism, with the resistance of our members, and I don't know whether they just don't believe what they belong to, or that they don't feel that they matter. But thinking about the psychology and the politics of people who have made a conscious decision to support universal single payer, and they have a piece of legislation in the legislature right now, would make us the most advanced model in the world were it to pass, most unconditional model for comprehensive coverage for every resident in the state of California, really is baffling. And that's our challenge. Our challenge is to somehow bring to life our membership as the 10 ring, because we can't go out and mobilize anybody else if we can't mobilize our own. And the issue is looking at doctors not as a block, but as a continuum of people in a spectrum of class consciousness or class alliance, because we are involved in a campaign that is the 1% against the 99%, and the 1% know it cold. They're totally clear that they can never let this happen, because it will fundamentally shatter their dictatorship of the corporate tyranny culture that we live in and that we've normalized. So we began putting out reports every month of the work that we were doing in order to assure the people that we were concretely on the ground and involved in a whole array of very serious activities and work that we were doing, talking, using our position in a very extraordinary way to go talk to lay audiences of all sorts, the faith community, the business community, the nonprofit community, the retired community, in order to show those communities really what our stake is as moral, ethical leaders in a society that is fundamentally crippled by gouging, profit, cruelty, brutality, barbarism, dismissal of the masses of people, because the 1%, the oligarchy, the dark money, is simply so well organized and so wealthy and so capable of generating, with a light touch, a major oppositional campaign that confuses and misinforms and disinforms people, that it's a piece of cake for them. And the only way we're going to be able to challenge them is to do what Bernie Sanders says, is organize a revolution. That's Bernie Sanders talking, not a Marxist. So we have to have the capacity to carry within us the urgency and the significance of this historical moment, because if we don't do it now, with Trump in office, when will we ever have a better set of circumstances in order to share with the general public the enormous, the profound transformational paradigm that universal health care would allow in a society that has been so constrained and so brutalized for so many decades, largely because of the way in which medical services are provided. We live in a medical ransom illness management system. Medical ransom illness management. We do not and should not talk about a healthcare system on their terms, because that's not what we're working in. That's not what we have. And language is everything here. We are after putting together a healthcare system. A healthcare system is not going to look anything like what we have on the ground today and that we have been suffering for the last 40 or 50 years, y'all. So being clear about what's at stake here and understanding the profound social, transformational politics of our campaign has got to bring us to our feet in a way that we have never stood up before. We cannot keep on keeping on, and we cannot keep doing what we've been doing that hasn't made a corner turn. Now, I know that you've got legislation in Washington that's been there for a long time, but what's new, according to David, is that you're building a major broad-based coalition of organizations from left to center that are going to be part of this enormous struggle, because it's a struggle that has a nexus both at the state level and at the national level. And the two will toggle back and forth. As the fascists and the reactionaries, as the oligarchy, as the 1% in Washington try and create a way of further oppressing and exploiting the general public and subordinating them to be able to essentially live in this nightmare that we're being forced into, we have to come back with a healing, transformational, passionate, inspired, brilliant campaign of personal outreach. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to think about what we can get the lay community to do to activate our doctors. And so one of the things that we're asking our general mass organizations to do, which Keith will talk about when he starts talking here, is to every single body has to call their own doctor and their own dentist and tell them today that they are scared to death of what's going to happen to their coverage and their ability to afford care because of what's going on in Washington, and they want their doctor to do something about it, to join PNHP. Because one of the things that we have to work on, number one, is making sure that you know who belongs to your organization in Washington, and number two, to get them off their chair and out from behind whatever it is that they're afraid of to become engaged, to lose some of the privilege and comfort of the situation that they're in, which only adds to the suffering and the delay of tens of thousands, millions of people in the United States that are waiting for us to be the spearhead for change. In California, it's the nurses that are the transformational force here, and they're being attacked and vilified in every way possible. But it's the doctors, and it doesn't take a lot of us to make the big change that have to become the fearless, bold, visionary, imaginative voice of transformation. Even one doctor in the midst of a group of people with the right politics and the right message and the right spirit can transform a room, can transform a conversation. So the bottom line here is we have to grow our membership. We have to begin to build a chapter system in California, because when we came on board just now, there was a state chapter, which really shouldn't be called a chapter because it's a state machine. And there was one chapter in the Bay Area. That was it, period. Nothing else. We have gone and we built a chapter in Los Angeles already from here, just by making a few phone calls and flying down there to meet with 15 or 18 of their cadre. We need to establish a set of structural bylaws that really are substantive, that create the foundation of what it is that we're all about. We need to challenge the medical professional community to engage and begin to rumble. We need to organize the student community. We've got to get at least half of our membership as students, because they're going to be the new landlords. And finally, we have to build a whole campaign of stories from the heart of practice. The most powerful thing that we've done so far, absent the letter writing campaign, was at our last general meeting, we got 6 doctors to stand up, which is going to be a regular part of every single general meeting we have, to tell their personal stories in 3 or 4 or 5 minutes to the rest of the people, because the doctors don't even talk to each other about the shit that they live with, about the horrors, about the heartbreak, about the frustrations. And there are changes going on in the medical community that are profoundly destabilizing right now, profoundly destabilizing. This whole concierge medicine situation that's going on, the whole subordination of doctors to corporate control more and more and more in Kaiser and all of these other major organizations. So the challenge to us is absolutely spectacular, and the opportunity is dizzying. It's intoxicating. But there has to be a sense of collective ferocity and vision and confidence and pride and drunken madness to move this thing forward. We can beat them. We will beat them. My friend Keith McCallin is the only other person that I talk with day in and day out. 2 of us are like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, you know, and I do the windmills, and then he makes sure that everything else works right all around. So here's Keith.
So I loved hearing the resumes of everyone around the table, because that means we're going to have a great Q&A. I always find when I'm out speaking about single payer, or in the last 9-10 months here now in California, SB 562, the single payer bill that we have in our legislature, the Q&As is always the best part. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and beware that the Qs will be back coming from this side as well. So I started as a physician assistant at a family practice, at a 4-doc family practice in Salinas, California. And because of that experience, I became a full-time healthcare activist. And so today, as I'm talking, think of me, I'm going to present as a healthcare activist, because I think that's where I bring the best information to the table here. So as I said, in California, we have the single payer bill, SB 562, that came out at the beginning of 2017. And so what happened prior to that, I started tabling for single payer all over the greater Sacramento area. I even included gun shows and went up into the conservative communities of the western slopes of the Sierras, because I really wanted to talk to everyone and find out what they were thinking about. At that point, I was pretty much riding the wave and energies of Bernie. And so I had some amazing conversations from people all across, from the constitutional conservatives way over on the right to the democratic socialists way over on the left. And the best conversations still to this day have come from finding out what the public was thinking, came from those tabling experiences. And what I found in 2016 was, number one, because of my experience as a healthcare provider in Salinas, I said to everyone, we have a very big doctor problem, because there was no doctors that I knew that were actually involved in pushing for single payer. being in California provided some great opportunities because there's a long, decades-long history of fighting for single payer here. So I was talking to some of what I like to call the OGs of single payer here, and they gave me a great history of what has happened for decades, all the way through 2016. But what I found in the population is that most of California has no idea that we have a single payer bill, has no opinion about health care. And then a small group of people read the papers and are somewhat informed, but they're mostly misinformed. And so what I realized very early on in 2016 is that I am not up against a reasonable alternative. I'm up against a boatload of misinformation, and it makes a mess of pretty much every conversation. So rather than say, I'm for this and versus that, it's this is the answer, and pretty much any argument for it coming from the other side is misinformation. A lot of it, it's amazing. It was amazing in 2016 to hear people quote lines that came out of a public relations campaign in 1948 that was effective in killing Truman's effort to fix health care. It was great fortune that at the end of 2016 that I started hearing a talk about a single payer bill. And the nice thing about it is that Senator Lara in California put forth that bill, which means we did not have to go find $1 million to do a financial study. We were able to work through the legislature to get that done. But now here in 2017, I found that we're still having most of the population having no idea there's a single payer bill. And those that do are effectively misled by all the major media. Everyone still talks about there's no way to pay for it. I can go into details on that later, but that's what we're up against. So here we are in 2017 in October here, and what I am up against right now is incrementalism versus the fix. So what I like to call incrementalism, it is the opposition. There's a long history for the past 40 years in this country. We've been trying to rework the for-profit insurance system to some better effect, and it has failed over and over. Administration has gotten larger. There has been no cost containment. And so it was an amazing thing to hear my state senator here in California, who is a physician, he's a pediatrician. He spent on the floor of the Senate arguing against SB 562. And in the space of 5 minutes, he used the word access 10 times. So what access is just another public relations ploy to tell everyone we're really working on the system, and all we have to do is to get everybody insured. And that is a really big battle that we're up against here. One of the big problems that we had in the first half of 2017 in the greater Sacramento area, because that's what I can speak specifically about, no outreach to business, which I think is one of our best arguments, most effective arguments, no outreach to faith, no outreach to minority communities. And so what I did is I called all of the local activists who I had been working with for 6 months, and I said, we need to talk. And I had 30 people show up representing 17 organizations. We now have outreach to faith. We now have been doing canvassing to businesses. And as Dr. Bronston mentioned, we're telling everyone we can to call their doctor and their dentist because we need to mobilize physicians. I firmly believe that if we can mobilize physicians, we can win the day. And the reason I believe this is that I don't think the challenge here in California is to try and convince the people who can't be convinced. The answer, the key, is to mobilize those who are convinced, because they do not come out and fight for it. They hand over their emails and they disappear. So when we have efforts to contact legislators, to write letters to the editors and things along those lines, it's always the same 20 or 30 people that come out and get busy. So if we can mobilize doctors to mobilize the citizenry, it's a whole new game, because that's never happened in the history of the fight for single payer. So that's kind of what we have going on here. We're up against incrementalism. It's very clear within the doctor community that in California, there's over 100,000 physicians. In the last 6 months, 3 physicians have been out on the street pushing for SB 562. So that's something that what we need to do in order to fix things, to shore up the shortcomings, is very clear. And getting physician authority is key.
The thing that we'd like to challenge you about is to really look with a new eye and a new intensity at your own organization. You are where you are because you've gotten into a groove of work that has essentially netted you over a period of 3 or 4 years the gains that you've accomplished. But they're not enough. And there has to be a whole very self-critical look at your database to find out whether the people on your roster are real and what they believe in and what they're willing to do to engage even in a conversation with you. We're not interested in getting our doctors to do die-ins or to show up at demonstrations or to use their time in any way. What we're looking for is the notion that doctors are readers and that they're intellectuals and that they're egotists, and try and to exploit those capacities, those natural characteristics in order to engage their participation in the operation. But beyond just being busy, there has to be a way of relooking one by one, almost in a come to Jesus kind of a situation about what's at stake. We're all around this table over 60, pretty much 50 or 60. And there are no kids around the table there with you. And where's your succession plan? And who is it that's paying dues? And do they think that this is going to happen by just them paying dues? Where can we engage? How can we engage by any means necessary, doctor by doctor, member by member, to begin to take root, to get traction, and to begin to make a contribution? I don't know what that contribution is, but every single member should be essentially accountable to tell you as the leadership what they're going to do this month, what they're going to do in November, what they're going to do in December, what they're going to do in January. And you need to analyze and lay out the priority agenda for this month. 1 or 2 critical things that have some way of measurement to know whether you're moving forward and getting to happen what you think you need to have happen. So the question of building diplomatic alliances, engaging yourself in the center of the largest coalition that can be put together there, looking at where your legislation is, looking at what's going on with the federal system and not getting caught in a dilution between the two. You know, if you don't, I mean, here in California, we believe that 95% of the work has to be done in terms of the state happening, because if California happens, Washington is going to be next. If California happens, the rest of the country is going to be next, because we are 1/6 of the national economy. And if it happens here, and it could happen here because we're this blue perimeter, the blue Pacific perimeter, we're in a position to be able to change not only America, but Canada, the whole world. The whole world will move when we move, because we're not going to move with the same naivete that the rest of the developed world has moved around universal health care. The rest of the world doesn't really have universal health care like we really know it has to be. We're not talking about socialized medicine. And the whole issue of incrementalism is totally legitimate after we have single payer in place. Then we're going to really need to do some major defense work and some immensely creative and immensely exciting collaborative thinking and imaginative thinking of how to move the system from tertiary care to primary care, from illness management to wellness promotion. I mean, the possibilities are so gorgeous. They're so romantic. They're so inspiring. We don't have the permission or the opportunity or the system to really use our creative capacity. And I swear to God, doctors have forgotten why they became doctors. They've been so brutalized and so essentially regimented in their subordinated kind of positions as employees of corporations that are totally heartless, that I don't know what it's going to take to revisit and re-experience the magic of why we wanted to take care of people in the first place.
The statistics suggest, poll after poll, that doctors are very much on board in increasing numbers with single payer. But I have to say, as I said earlier, I do not see that out on the street. But I think that's really a very large potential that's out there. That there's, if you go on, if anybody's on Twitter, let me know because we need to link up. But if you go on Twitter, you can see these conferences. The American Association of Family Practitioners had one recently, and they are so close. They're like a syllable away from saying that they're for single payer, but they just don't take that last step. And I think that's important to understand because I don't think that's them giving lip service. I think that's them really wanting to take that step, but they don't feel that they are able this day. But I think that's like the Hoover Dam. I think that's a great potential that we can tap into and just burst it open.
We exist on a continuum. We exist on a continuum of class awareness. Doctors are not a block, and the people that are speaking for the doctors are majorly stakeholders in the status quo. And the membership of their organizations either have nothing to say or essentially are subordinated to their leadership because they don't want to get into a gunfight. So what I would invite you, with all love and respect and solidarity, is to really spend some serious time and have a very deep internal look at what would be a radical, self-critical analysis of where you are and what you need to do to really rebuild. And the Atlanta meeting is going to be very important. And David or whoever goes to the Atlanta meeting has to go with recommendations and drive them home that PNHP has to get much more ferocious in terms of validating its membership and getting them active by any means necessary and no excuses. We cannot let this moment slip by us. We can have single payer by 2021. We can have single payer by 2021.
Robert Czar, the recent past president of PNHP, I think I am the only one in the entire United States that stood up and cheered on November 18th when he issued an open letter to all healthcare providers, physicians specifically, saying that it's not enough anymore to be just healers. We have to become activists in order to advocate for our patients. And I just thought that was brilliant. I see PNHP struggling to make that transition. And I think it's important that we understand that that's where PNHP is right now and encourage that because I think there's enough leadership at the top that's saying those words, but it's not the leadership. It's going to have to come up from the base.
Anyway, thank you very much for this presentation. You've said a lot of things that I've thought about PNHP for many, many years. And just to mention one thing, our PNHP chapter, like here in the audience here today, there's actually only two practicing physicians and 2 retired physicians of the entire audience here. And on our board, the vast majority of our board is non-physician. And we've had a very difficult time with recruiting doctors. And I did about 3 years ago, I took it upon myself, maybe 4 years ago, when I was, I think, the president of the chapter. I met with 6 doctors who were all PNHP members, all dues paying. And as far as we know, they're all single-payer advocates to the core. And I met with all 6 of them for like 2-hour sessions over coffee to discuss like what we were doing. And none of them showed any slight interest or came to anything. So I've actually, in terms of my activism, I do it really mostly in other organizations that are working on single-payer and not trying to work with physicians.
All that story means is that you went to 6 people. So you've got good experience with 6 people, but you've now got about 40,000 more in the Washington area to go to. So I understand that this is really painful and really demoralizing.
I spent 2 hours on 40,000 people, and well, anyway, that's just my experience. I understand what you're saying, but I haven't found that the physicians are where the activism is, at least not in this area. And most of the groups we work with here are non-physician.
Let me, in all respect, you haven't found where you're effective. It has nothing to do with them. It has to do with you. I don't mean you personally, but there is going to be a way for you to think about what you do, what you say, what you show, who you contact with, how you're going to work with the professional community that really hinges upon your imagination. Don't blame the people who aren't willing to come around because you haven't figured out yet how to get them to come around. It's like raising a kid. You know, you don't want to say that the kid's the problem just because you haven't figured out how to parent them properly. I mean, we're suffering the same problem. God knows we're suffering the same problem. And I say to myself, how can I do it better? I didn't do it right. I can't allow this to define the truth of the matter. The truth of the matter is we're going to win. We're going to move those doctors like they did in Saskatchewan, like they did in France. So we just got to go back to the drawing boards and to really relook at the paradigm of your personal awareness as a group and to not take no for an answer from now on.
Well, I also think, so one of the things I've said from very early on, because the problem in mustering physicians to this cause is very clear, and I think we need to look clearly at that. I've always thought that the best way to do it is first with earnest appeal, of course, to those that are inclined to listen to that, but I also think by provocation. I'm always amazed at the extent to which patients do not, I guess, just take physicians to task. That they sit there and listen to the physician saying, oh, I'm sorry, that's not covered, that's out of network, let's keep looking, but they never say to the physician, why is that? What part do you play in that? Let's point to the opioid epidemic. That's, big pharma. There's many people to blame, but how often do we hear that physicians are to blame? Now, I don't at all suggest that we go out and pick a fight, but one of the things that we talked about already that I'm really pushing, and I'm starting to get a really positive response from a lot of healthcare activists, is call your doctor and ask them on behalf of the patient, have the patient ask, do this for me. I need this. And I think that we may find an inroad in that direction.
I'll send you a script. I'll send David a script to share with all of you. But really and truly, I don't want to hear why you can't do something because, that's endless. It's endless. That's part of the incrementalism. I want to hear what you're going to do different. And I don't say that in a angry way or in any way. I mean, we're in the same boat. We haven't been able to make this move, and PNHP hasn't been able to make the move despite our brilliance, and we are brilliant. There's no question about it. But we're not imaginative. We're not imaginative, and we're not courageous enough. And we make excuses for our kind.
Let's get some other people to participate here.
Hi, Bill and Keith. My name's Jonathan. I'm one of the non-medical people here. My wife is actually the medical activist, but give me a second to frame sort of a concept, and I'd like you to sort of respond to it. I'm an educator. I was until recently the president of the teachers union here in Seattle. And, we faced kind of a similar situation a few years ago about getting our members organized for, very unengaged membership in our union, just real low turnout, nobody's participating in anything. And so when I became president, we actually reached out and started a listening campaign. And so I and it was very successful. We would go out and not actually talk to people for 2 hours, but actually go out and just ask for 5 or 10 minutes to listen to their experience. Like, what is your experience here in Seattle Public Schools? Why did you become a teacher? What's, what are the issues for you? What's happening? Just, as an educator, I know what they are. I've been an educator for a while in Seattle Public Schools, and I really, in those conversations, was never truly surprised by the responses that my peers gave me about their experience. I have had many of them as well. But in that conversation and in that moment of just listening and having them understand that you as an organizer are there to validate their experience and give them
Right.
the permission to feel
Right.
what they feel and articulate it
Right.
was very powerful for all of them. I had many people say, I've been a member of this unit for 30 years. No one has ever come and asked me what I thought. And that was a powerful experience for me as the president.
What are you proposing?
So, well, I want you to respond to this, but the last thing that we did that I think was key to our organizing our members, in 2015 we had a strike where we had 97% of our members on the picket line.
Bravo.
After 3 years of organizing. But the last question we asked when we went out and had those listening sessions was, tell me who is the trusted and respected peer that you think of that I should also talk to? Who is the trusted and respected member in your building where you work that I should also hear from? And we took those people very consciously, because we wanted to hear from the people in the teaching community who they thought were already the natural leaders among their peers. And
Right.
we took those people and targeted our efforts to organize on those people. And I want to know what you think about sort of this organizing.
That's powerful.
Your challenge is to share success stories with each other, not failures with each other. Failures, we got millions, but you got to figure out what works. So my quick answer to you is we've branded a thing we call the stories from the heart of practice. And we want to build that conversation and get invite doctors to talk about what's going on in their practice. What framework, what environment can you invite doctors to talk about the things that are hurting them? And make it clear that that's what you want them to come and talk about. Now, they're going to be shy, intimidated, or resistant to that invitation. But once you start the ball rolling and have a way to share those by videotaping those stories and then putting them up on YouTube, some kind of a way to talk about the stories from the heart of practice, from the status quo, and little by little invite people to imagine what would be an antidote to that situation if we had single payer. Start going and building stories from the heart of practice as a fundamental invitation to get a conversation going and keep it going and broaden it.
Although I have to say, as you were telling that I think that's a brilliant idea, because what I've been trying to do, so I'm not the Paul Revere of this community. I've had to come to terms with that. But what I've been doing is been searching for that maven, that Paul Revere, who does, when he says jump, the community says, oh, we better listen to him because he has such a track record of good sense. And I will take what you just said and apply that as I search for that person in the community. That's a great idea right there.
So, Peter?
I had a question. You're saying that it's very difficult to recruit practicing physicians. To what extent might that be because they're afraid of being cut from narrow networks?
Right.
A group of doctors from this group went to the Washington Medical Association, biannual convention a couple years back, and I heard secondhand that was a big deal. People did not want to be the nail that sticks out and gets hammered down by being cut from a network.
That's a good question, and that was always a concern. And until recently, we really had no idea whether that was real or where that stood. We recently brought on a Kaiser doc. Our Kaiser doc was part of the PNHP membership already. And it was really nice to have a meeting with a bunch of Kaiser docs in there, because all the Kaiser docs in the room were in the room because they believed single payer was the fix. Now, just for the record, Kaiser in California came out very much against SB 562. I won't get into the details of that, but to speak to your concern, one of the docs in our membership went around and did a query of all the docs that she works with within Kaiser. None of them had any reluctance to talk about single payer. So within Kaiser, an organization that's against SB 562, we're finding a whole bunch of allies who are willing to speak freely. I'm sure it does exist, but I have not found that doc that pulls me aside and says, hey, look, here's the thing, here's my opinion, but don't tell anyone I told you so. But it's a fair concern.
I think if you organize some kind of a hearing and properly figured out how to get people to a hearing of some sort, or some kind of theater that allows people to talk while you're listening, a panel of listeners, like what we have just talked about, some way of reframing your commitment to their safety, to their emancipation, to their pain, to their humiliation, to their successes, in the framework that we're working with, because we are, wherever you are on the continuum of having single payer in the nation, you're on that continuum. And the whole purpose here is to build a head of steam and to build capacity and to build a beautiful conversation. We can make that conversation so beautiful, more than any other constituency in the coalition, because we're both consumers and providers. And we have a tremendous, whether it's real or not, privileged position in terms of being listened to and being respected and being trusted. And we have to work on that. We have to get back to why we're in it. We've forgotten truly, and we don't ever talk about why we're in it in a way that's compelling and amplified.
But one of the things that I also think that's worth mentioning is that I no longer really, I would love for a 100, 200 docs to come to the fore and lead onwards. I'm not sure that's going to happen. So what I did is created that coordinating committee that I mentioned earlier, and we broke it down into the 9 sectors of faith and community and business and media and political and government and the disability community. And so physicians and healthcare providers, just like everyone else in the community, are invited to take a look at our structure and go to the area where they think they can contribute. We have a great example of a physician who came to the PNHP meeting, and he's not part of the healthcare sector of that coordinating committee. He went over to business, and he's part of the outreach to the business communities. So we don't have to ask physicians to become, part of the healthcare. It's kind of makes sense, but wherever they can contribute, just like every other citizen in the community, they have to kind of find where they can contribute. They can't be assigned.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, my question is about maybe would it help to have narrower, more highly specific asks? Like when people say, yeah, they're interested, that's a very vague kind of thing. But you say, if once a month or once every 2 months, you could put it on your calendar to write a letter to either do one of two things, write a letter to the editor or call your state or federal representatives. You put it on your calendar and make it something that you could do. If you had something fairly narrow and specific that you could ask of them, would that help?
You must go to your roster and find out who's real at the other end of that phone and the other end of that email. You've got to take the time. What we did in LA, we got the roster from national, 862 names. And we met for 5 or 6 hours in Los Angeles with 15 organizers, none of whom were really active in PNHP, but all whom identified with PNHP. And we literally walked through all 860 names and assigned them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 level, totally in the game, totally against the game, and then 2, 3, 4 were sort of in the middle in terms of specific characteristics. And we literally identified every single person from around the room that we knew that we could essentially speak to what their politics were. Then the number ones, who were the ones in the game, were all phone called. There were only, out of 862 people, 45 people were in the one group, about 45, 48, 50 were in the two group. The largest group were the people we didn't know. There was about 500 in the group we didn't know. And those top 90 people were distributed amongst the 15 people in the room, and they personally called those people to the very first meeting in Los Angeles that's been held in almost 2 years. And about 40 people came, and a chapter was established with tremendous enthusiasm. And the people who said they didn't have the time, the best organizers, became part of the steering committee based on the feedback from those people. So one of the things that I think has got to happen is you've got to have the patience and the diplomacy to call your own members and find out what you're sitting on. Are you on a ghost ship, or do you have something real? And what is real about what you have real? Find out who your people are and say, you've got to come to a meeting. We've got to have some kind of a conference, some kind of piece of theater that would be very self-satisfying. And it may be come and talk about your practice. Everybody's going to have 5 minutes to talk and listen to each other. And let's just sum up what the hell we're living with, what's going on here. Why are we in this quietist, despondent, helpless, hopeless, compromised situation? Why are we slugging it out when we could throw the insurance industry into the trash can overnight? We can do it. We're gonna do it.
but so in California, the Healthy California campaign, which is the multi-organizational coalition that is pushing SB 562 at the state level, we are there. We do have targeted legislators that we reach out to at very specific times, so that the state will contact me. I will send out to my email list that says now is our time to contact our assemblymen. So yes, that does happen. I try to extend that by trying to get people who say, look, I want to get on board, but I just don't have the time. And I said, well, how about once a week you call your legislator, both the state senator and the state assembly person. I don't know how much success I've had. This is all a big experiment.
I don't think that having them do something alienated is going to get you anywhere. I think that between now and December, if you did nothing between now and December, but find out if your membership are committed to PNHP, really committed to PNHP and willing to engage in a conversation, that would be the most radical thing you could possibly do. In the next 2.5 months, get your own act together so that you know if you've only got 35 people there, or 135, or 235. I don't know how you're going to pull it together, but don't ask people to go do something somewhere else. You want them to come back and talk to you, not their legislator. They've got to weigh in with the organization. Then you're in a position to be able to work out a deal with them as to what they think listening to them is going to be effective, and then deal with the incrementalism, because there are going to be people who are on that spectrum, that class awareness spectrum, that are not going to believe that this is workable. They will pay lip service to single payer. They'll pay lip service to the principle, but they are not really going to believe and do anything about fighting for it, because it's going to make them vulnerable. And we've got to get over that. We're the most fragile, frightened group of people in the consortium. No more frightened than a dog. And you know that you've got to be brutally honest with each other. You've got to go to your membership and find out who the hell they are and what their stake is. And God damn it, if they're paying their dues, then you expect them to open their emails and you expect them to come and meet and talk and think. That's what they're all about. They've got to think together how we're going to skin this cat and how we're going to serve the larger community. Because you're the catalytic group. And a whole group of y'all are going to go north with the 1%. But the bulk of you are going to go south with the 99%. And that's the ones you want.
Bill, this is Holly. And I'm not asking this question from the perspective of a doctor. I'm asking this question from the perspective of a patient.
Right.
And I started walking with epilepsy in my mid-30s. I started having epileptic seizures, and that's my story. And it was quite a journey, but this is something that I observed over the course of time, dealing with doctors and hospitals, is a kind of psychosis that is generated by the healthcare system inside doctors and nurses. And I wonder if you see this as well. And it's a deep disconnect between what doctors know and what they're allowed to do. And the way that I started to observe this is when I would find myself in a hospital room, having just had a big epileptic seizure and being taken into a hospital when I didn't want to go, but was forced to, and then came out of the seizure on a hospital bed, looking at a doctor. I would ask them, I'd take advantage of the situation, and I would say, tell me everything you know about epilepsy. Tell me what you know. And I literally had doctors literally say, I don't know anything. Or sometimes literally shrug their shoulders. And at first that made me really angry. And I just thought they were being ridiculously dismissive. And I would go out from those hospital rooms and I would go find a whole bunch of books about epilepsy, and there was a ton to know. And I would say, why is the doctor saying they don't know? And then I started to realize, because I am who I am, that the system wasn't allowing them to practice their craft. And that they were being placed in these situations where they weren't being given the space to have a true conversation with a patient. And I started to realize these doctors, I started to go from anger to compassion. And I wanted to take the doctors in my arms and hug them and say, I love you. Tell me what you know. Even quietly, I won't tell the healthcare system that you're actually giving me counsel.
So if you had a room
But let
about,
me just tell you, do you think that this creates a disconnect between what doctors know and what they do, and that this is creating, in some of them, a sense of just why even try?
that
A sense of
testimony,
not wanting to become active, and that we really need to reach out to doctors and show them that a universal healthcare system would actually allow them to practice the craft that they've studied.
so what you've just done is you just provided a story from the heart of practice. It was about 3.5 to 4 minutes long altogether. And that story and the question you ask needs to be heard by 40 or 50 physicians sitting around you so that they can have the courage to talk about their stories too. Everybody has their story that comes from their heart of what could possibly rehumanize, transform, radically change our relationship to one another. And it's that kind of closeness and warmth and honesty that the 1% cannot tolerate. They cannot, because it builds community, it builds unity, it builds union, it builds solidarity, it builds democracy. We're fighting a culture war, a class culture war in our demand for single payer. And your story is a living example of exactly what I'm asking you, begging you to try and organize. Begin to have gatherings where people, you give your exact same testimony that you just gave, you tell that story. It's magnificent, it's moving.
Yeah.
And people have to feel.
I want you to know that I wrote a book, and I did tell my story, and I told it very beautifully. I'm an incredible writer, as well as I am a beautiful, beautiful choreographer. That was my life, was on the stage as a dancer.
So what do you
But
think?
I want you to know
about what I'm
that
suggesting?
my book is published and it's on the market, and I mean it's there. And I'm telling my story, and I do think everybody needs to stand up and tell their stories. And I'm a theater artist, and I couldn't agree with you more.
Can you help PNHP organize a series of events that will facilitate that experience with you as a role model and others? Everybody around, look, I bet you anything that those of you around this table, if you took a meeting and each one of you told one story about something from the heart of your practice, it would be one of the most moving and powerful meetings you'll ever have in the organization. Every one of you are sitting on the most incredible experiences, whether they are specific patient experiences or system problems or whatever, or solutions that you've experienced. All of that is relevant, but you don't talk to each other about what really matters. You come and you talk in the abstract about building a single payer system without getting at the heart of your practice, of what it is that you're experiencing. That's what's going to move this revolution. That's what's going to move the membership.
What's interesting is, so I spent most of 2016 learning and studying and reading the books and talking to the OGs and talking to physicians. And I can talk nuts and bolts of single payer right now. And a couple of months ago, I was in my state senator's office speaking with a group of people, speaking to one of their staffers. And I was ready to hit them hard with my facts. And a woman stood up and told a story that brought the room to tears. And it was just a personal story. And she taught me a lesson. that there's time for facts and there's time for stories. And I really do believe, and so does Dr. Bronston here, that the stories will ultimately win the day, because anybody can counter argue the facts. Nobody can argue a story from the heart. They win every time.
Okay, last question, Charles.
Listen, we're here for the night. You can keep asking.
Our room is, we got to be out of here in about 15 minutes.
I'll write you a doctor's note.
You seem to be good at that. I want to follow up on the issue of physician vulnerability, getting kicked out of networks, being ostracized, and what have you. Up in here in Seattle, probably about 75 to 80% of the doctors are employed, which raises the question of a union. It changes the whole dynamic of the old days when everybody was self-employed, and that didn't apply.
Right.
If you talk about leverage, you know, when I was head of the King County Medical Society, I suggested to the board one night to think about forming a doctors' union to get some leverage in this world. Down where you are, have you thought about that? Is it at all possible? I mean, that's one way that doctors can be protected if they want to stand up and speak out.
The Union of American Physicians and Dentists is California. I don't know whether it's a national organization that has all of the county and the state workers in a union. He's going to be one of our major speakers at our next general meeting on the 29th of this month, and there is a union, and there's private practitioners in the union as well as public practitioners. So there are those models. There's the VA. The VA, you know, is an organized operation as well, and the head of the VA is a PNHP member. The head of the transplant organization here in the Sierra area is a PNHP member. And so we're writing a letter to the transplant community about the need for them to endorse single payer, because people may be able to donate, but if they don't have money or insurance, they can't be a recipient, right? So there's all these marvelous opportunities to think creatively about all the groups around you that you sort of take for granted that are totally relevant, and it has to do with their stories. Their stories. I had the head of the VA talk about the data of the VA system in Northern California on every criteria. The VA absolutely buried every other delivery system in terms of quality outcomes. And I asked him why. He says, because we have a different kind of implementation that's not dependent upon money. It's dependent upon outcomes, and we're all focused on quality outcomes. And they're dealing with some of the poorest, you know, and the most fragile and sickest folk, you know, in the society.
But it's also a great question. It makes me think of United Artists, the artists that kind of got together in the entertainment industry so that they could have more creative input. So the only doc that I've ever known who was both brilliant in practice and brilliant in business was the one that I worked for in Salinas. But I found her to be a rare human being. And I think under a single payer system, the docs that really want that creativity do not want to take on the burden of, I would imagine, don't want to take on the burden of the business side, the negotiation side, that whole mess. So the idea that in California, that there is already an established union that's somewhat contained because it's specific docs within corrections and that work with the state. If SB 562 were to pass today, I would imagine that they would have a great opportunity to bring other docs in and negotiate for those docs so the docs could do what? Practice medicine.
The question you're asking is not a question to be answered based on the mechanics of the question, but the politics of the question. The issue is that what you're asking is, given the position that doctors are being more and more forced into, proletarianized, in a essentially corporate tyranny, how do you get that conversation to become a conscious concern? Like what's happening here is that there's a lot of push for this thing called concierge medicine, where doctors are literally leaving into a very private entrepreneurial role where they get patients to give them $6,000 or $8,000 a year in order to take care of them 24/7.
On top of their health insurance.
So there are fractures happening in the practice, but what you need to be really watchful about is that doctors are not a block. that there's a spectrum of physicians that have a stake in the status quo and a group that are misinformed and think that they are safer or better or can't imagine an alternative, but the facts will move them to the left, and then you have a group of people that are all in like yourselves. I get it, that put it all together, but it's examining the cultural and organizational implications of a democratic and transformational delivery system that is going to net you the most powerful conversations and the most compelling exchanges and the most advocacy to mobilize membership. You've got to build your numbers, and you've got to diversify. You've got to get more doctors in your organization. You can't make excuses that they're not recruitable. They are recruitable. We just haven't figured out how to get them yet. But we've got to figure out how to get them. We have no choice. We're too important to the struggle, and we have to move our doctors away from being some defenders of the status quo and on the take. And the people who speak for most doctors are on the take. That's why we have the problem we have. And most doctors are not political. They're just kind of doing their job. They're just innocents. They're protected. They're guarded. They're very unsophisticated. They're apolitical, and they're obedient.
I loved how in Canada, when they went to a single payer system, all the doctors went on strike. And then by political force, they were obliged to return. And when they returned, they all found they were making the same or a little bit more than when they left. And I think that's a great lesson for healthcare providers when they're worried about what's coming with a change such as this.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to getting what Bill is going to send to the chapter here about how we can organize doctors, and we'll bring it up at our
It'd be a good thing for our annual public meeting, workshops.
Excellent, excellent.
Okay.
You know, we may be able to come up there if you need us to run a panel or whatever it is. You know, I think we can make it up there.
Okay.
Great.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you
night.
so much
so
for the
much.
invitation.
Good night.